So, good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to continue today on our lecture related to chapter 10 on age and sex composition. But before I continue on it, I just want to show you a couple of slides that I added to lecture 1 related to chapter 1. I just thought these graphs here were interesting. Philip Coyne, he's a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Maryland, and I follow him on Twitter. And exactly yesterday, he posted these graphs here that he generated. It's just interesting to see that we have seen before the number of overall cases of COVID-19 in the US that have been dropping in more recent weeks. But then he just did the same estimation, but just using college town counties. And then we also see a drop, but exactly around when classes start, the number of cases starts to increase a lot. And some people might say, oh, but this population is basically mostly people between 18 and 22 years of age. They're not so much at risk of dying of COVID-19, but they can spread to other people if they visit parents, if they visit older friends, and so on. And of course, younger people are not completely immune of dying because of this, but this is just an interesting graph to show if we break down the analysis, you get more nuances related to it. So this slide is right after that slide that I had shown to you about deaths in Texas, and this one about cases. And here's some specific areas that have cases per 10,000 the last 2 weeks. So it's just interesting to see the difference between the US average or the US total and the overall trend, or actually the overall trend cases per 100,000. So that's a rate. And then the rate of cases in college town county. So these are all rates. That's why we can compare them, because they're taking into account in the denominator the population of the whole US in this case, and the population of this college town counts in this case. I also added a couple of other slides here, made some adjustments here, better explaining what are these cohorts in slide 44 of lecture 1. And then I added this table here that was generated by Dudley Poston, was just now published now also this month in this magazine. And just to give you a better idea of the year of birth of each one of these birth cohorts, the age range of these people that were born between these years, now in 2020, and of course some of them, none of them are alive anymore. The number of total people born for each one of these cohorts, and then you see the jump from the lucky to baby boomers, as we mentioned before. And alive in 2019, out of all those people that were born in these years, how many are alive now? And then kind of like an average of number born per year. And again, to see jump from the lucky few to the baby boomers is really interesting, because exactly the change in the size of the cohort change their demands for more schooling when they are younger ages, universities when they are young adults, and then into the labor market when they enter, when they start looking for jobs. This graph was already there, and this other one, I also got it from Professor Dudley Poston, who is the author of the textbook that we have been using in our course. And just to show the increase from one cohort to the other, and here the baby boomers really jump in size because of fertility increase after World War II. And the new boomers, as try to make it more clear here, are pretty much the millennials, which are also called Generation Y. So you might see these different ways of calling this specific cohort. And yeah, so those are the slides that I added. On the lecture about age and sex composition, just in this slide here, 21, I just tried to summarize a little bit, and then I added this last bullet point here. Because when we start talking about the age-sex structure, composition of a specific population, and we saw in some of the examples here that some populations had really higher proportion, more people in younger ages, and then as fertility decline and also mortality decline, we start to see a lower proportion of people in younger ages. And so the main characteristics of age transitions is exactly a change from very young to older populations. And usually mortality rates, when they first start to decline in a specific country, they start to decline more in relation to diseases related to infections, communicable diseases, which benefit a lot the survival of children, of infants. So those that are really young, they benefit from the first declines in mortality that countries experience. And so because of that, you might see first an increase in the proportion of people in younger ages because they are surviving a little more. But then following the decline in mortality, people start to have fewer children. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about that in the following chapter about the demographic transition. Mortality decline is followed by the fertility decline. And then you start to see these younger people getting older. And since they're having fewer children, the population starts to have a more older composition. And that's what we saw before here. For example, this graph for the world, and 6.8 men between the ages of 0 and 4 in 1950. And then this percentage starts to decline. And then the population starts to get older. So that main characteristic of the age transition. You start to see populations going from very young population, people, a lot of concentration in their ages, and then with the fertility decline, the population starts to get older. So I just added that information in that slide. And then we continue now here on the next topic of this chapter about dependency. And I already talked a little bit about age dependency here even in the first chapter of our course, when I mentioned the total dependency ratio, when I was differentiated between what is a ratio and what is a rate. And a popular measure of age structure is the total dependency ratio. So we pretty much get the number of children in a specific society and the number of elderly people, so number of children, those people between 0 and 14 years of age, and the elderly population, those with at least 65 years of age. And then we divide the overall amount of these two groups here by the people in working age. So people in working ages, usually the standard that we see here is from 15 to 64, but you might see some variations. Some people might use the working ages here from 15 to 60 or 15 to 69, but usually we're gonna see 15 to 64. And like we have been talking before, it's good to follow these conventions, these standards, in order to compare with historical data. And this ratio is usually multiplied by 100. So we get the information in 100%. So the higher the ratio, the more people each worker has to support. And the workers here, these people between 15 and 64. And these people between 15 and 64 are also called the producers. And children and older people are called also the consumers, right? So when you start to have more producers, when you start to have an increase in the number of consumers, in relation to the number of producers, the ratio starts to go up, because this is the numerator of the form and this is the denominator. And that means that these people here in working ages will have to support more people in outside of the working age. And the lower the ratio, it means that we have fewer dependents. It means that we have fewer dependents or fewer consumers in relation to the number of workers, in relation to producers, right? So more consumers in relation to producers, more people which worker has to support, fewer consumers in relation to producers, the ratio goes down, the fewer the number of dependents that this population here will have to support. And going one step further, demographers usually like to split these two ratios, like this ratio, the total dependency ratio, in two ratios. One is the youth dependency ratio. The youth dependency ratio pretty much using the numerator, the number of children, and the denominator, the population, then the overall number of people in working ages. And the old age dependency ratio, also sometimes called the aged dependency ratio, we get the number of elderly people, those with at least 65 years of age, and divide by the working age population. And the youth dependency ratio added to the old age dependency ratio equals the total dependency ratio, right? So these are all different ways to call old age or aged dependency ratio. They are pretty much synonyms here. And this is an example for different countries. So here we have the youth dependency ratio for all these countries in 2014, the old age dependency ratio, and the total dependency ratio. And you see for example, Macau, let me just see here, the countries with fewer proportions in youth dependency ratios are exactly Macau, China, North Korea, Spain, Russia. And then some countries in Africa are the ones that have a high proportion of children in relation to people in working ages. So the countries that have higher proportion of children, of those between 0 and 14 years of age, in comparison to those between 15 and 64, are these cases here in this example: Nigeria, Gambia, Uganda, Chad, and Niger, right? So in this case here, we are saying that for every 100 people between the ages of 15 and 64 years of age, we have 96 children in Uganda in 2014, right? And then you see, on the other hand, that countries, more developed countries, in this case here, for example, Japan and Italy, that fertility declined a lot and had improvements in mortality rates. So that makes more people reach ages beyond 65. You start to see old age dependency ratio increasing. So for example, in Japan, out of 100 people between the ages of 15 and 64, out of for every 100 people in working ages, they had almost 43 people with at least 65 years of age back in 2014. So you see these different patterns. And the total dependency ratio pretty much adds both of them. But you still see that African countries, they overall have more consumers than producers. For example, Chad here has 100, for every 100 workers between the ages of 15 and 64, they have 104 their children or older people. So this data here is for a series of countries and for a specific year. You can also collect this information for several years for one single country. And that's this example here. This is the youth dependency ratio in China and in the US between 1950 and 2050. And youth dependency ratio, you had kind of like a high fertility in China before the 80s, and that caused the number of children in relation to people in working ages to be high compared to the US. But as fertility started to decline in China due to the one-child policy and also to socioeconomic development, urbanization, and so on, it starts to reach the same levels as the US. And then starting in 2010, the youth dependency ratio is lower in China than in the US, which means that in China now, they have fewer children than people in working ages, fewer proportion of children than people in working ages compared to the US. So for example, let's say here in the US, in 2040, we expect that for every 100 people in working ages, we're gonna have 30 children. And in China, we expect to have something around 28 children for every 100 workers, right? Of course, these are projections for these next decades. And then the age dependency ratio, we start to see the opposite trend, exactly because now mortality, the first declines in mortality, as we're going to discuss throughout the course, they usually benefit, as I mentioned before, children, like infants. So because now you start to have some basic public health measures being taken, and then children don't die before the age of 1 or before the age of 5 as much before. And but then as mortality starts to improve even further, that starts to benefit older people. So older people start to live longer. By doing that, by having more older people proportional in relation to the working age population, the age dependency ratio increases over time. And it's expected to keep increasing a lot, in China even more, and in the US, increasing up to 2030 and then staying stable over time. Because then for the improvements in mortality and the changes in fertility don't change as much. But what is interesting to see is that in China, back in 1950, around for every 100 workers, they had around 7.5 people with at least 65 years of age. But they're expected to have around 37.5 older people with at least 65 years of age for every 100 people in working age. And that's a huge increase in 100 years, right? So really showing a change in age structure on age transition, right? As I talked before, the main, one of the main characteristics of the age transition is starts to have fewer younger people over time and more older people over time compared to people in middle ages, right? And this is an example of Brazil showing all the ratios together in the same graph from 1950 to 2050, also based on projections of the United Nations. So here, the overall, the total dependency ratio using children and older people in the numerator, it increased a little bit up to 1965, and then fertility started to decline in Brazil after that. So it starts to have fewer children, as the orange line here really shows, and then stays stable. It's expected to stay stable until around 2030, and then it's going to start to grow up, to start to increase again. In order to better understand what's behind those changes over time, it's good to break the total dependency ratio by child dependency ratio. In this case here, it's the orange line, and then the purple line, the old age dependency ratio. So in previous years, up to around the 2000s, the total dependency ratio was really driven by the trends in the child dependency ratio. So fertility declined so much in Brazil that the child dependency ratio started to decline, and then the overall, the total dependency ratio started to decline. And then mortality started little by little to start to benefit older groups. So older people started to live longer. And at first, in these decades up to the 1990s, that did not really improve a lot their life expectancy. But then in more recent years, they start to increase, and they're expected to increase in proportion even more. So around 2050, out of 100 workers, we expect in Brazil to have around 30 older people for every 100 workers, and the same, around 30 children, or a little less than that, in relation to the 100 workers. And a lot of studies are being done to try to understand these changes over time and what are the reasons behind it, and also how this change in age structure affects all the outcomes in the population in terms of health outcomes, labor outcomes, and so on. So we try to understand what's causing these changes, but also what the changes in age structure affects all the aspects of our lives. And this moment here in the history, and this moment here in which the total dependency ratio reaches really low levels, it's going to start to increase again. Why is it going to start to increase? We're going to start to have a higher proportion of older people in the population. So this decline was driven by the child dependency ratio decline, and this increase is really driven by increases in old age dependency. And this moment in society is when you have the lowest levels of total dependency ratios. It's what demographers call the demographic dividend. And some people might also call it the demographic bonus. It's a moment in our society that we have fewer consumers in relation to producers. So technically, we have more producers proportional to sustain children and older people. So if we have a dynamic society, creating jobs, good policies implemented, even before that, to train, to give higher education to children, so a higher proportion of children go to the university, and then when they enter the labor market, they can be more productive, they have better skills, and then that would increase economic growth and economic development in those countries. So this here is pretty much a window of opportunity. That's another term that demographers use, a window of opportunity. It's an opportunity that the age structure that is changing over time. Now, in this specific time here, you have fewer consumers compared to producers. It's a window of opportunity that now, having more producers, they could enter in the labor market with better skills, with better education. If previous policies were implemented, the country can grow more. Because in this moment here, you have fewer pressure in schools for children and fewer pressure in social benefit, social security for older people. But this is not automatic. So there are several studies showing like you should first invest in education for the children before this specific window of opportunity. So more proportion of people go to the university. You should increase gender equality. Men and women have the same rights in the society. You should increase female labor force participation. So women are also producers in that society. So there are several different policies that can be implemented. Think about reforms in the social security system in order to, after this window of opportunity is gone, we have some savings for the older population that's going to retire. And if we don't do this, we don't take advantage of this window of opportunity, and we might have issues in the future. Because in the future, then we start to have a higher proportion of older people in relation to workers. And if they don't have enough savings, if the country did not take advantage of this moment here, we might have what some demographers call a demographic onus. So this term here, demographic dividend, the demographic bonus, they are more used. Demographic onus is not really used that much, but I kind of like put it here to kind of show that this process is here they are interrelated in the sense that if you don't take you don't take advantage of this specific moment in time, you might get pressure on Social Security benefits, you might get pressure on health and several other government policies, government services. And in Brazil, this window of opportunity is expected to finish by 2030. And these last years, or these last couple of years, Brazil has been really stagnated economically. So we are not taking advantage of this specific time. This window, this time window here varies for country to country, right? So but that's an interesting topic of study, and that can be done for all different countries. Cool. The next topic chapter is about an issue with data related to age of people, which is called here age heaping. Demographers use data from single years of age to determine whether there are irregularities or inconsistencies in data. Which kind of inconsistencies? In this case here, we're talking about age heaping. Happens if a population tends to report certain ages at the expense of the other. So when we go to specific households to implement a census or a household survey, any kind of question, and we ask the person, what's your age? If we start to see a pattern in which people are over-reporting being 10, 15, 20, 25-year-old instead of the ages in between, we might be experiencing an issue with data related to age. Age heaping tends to be more pronounced among populations or population subgroups with low levels of education. So usually those with lower levels of education attainment tend to misreport their ages with higher chances. And then we see a lot of that, a lot of misreporting around the ages ending in 0 to 5.
Is that just because people with less education are just misreporting their age because they don't know how to report their age, or how does that work? When you say with lower levels of education.
Yes, that's exactly what you're saying. It's usually people with lower levels of education, they might not know exactly their exact ages. Okay. That might not make that much sense for us here in the US, but if you think in developing countries, that might be more likely. But I'm not saying that all people with lower levels of education are misreporting their ages. It's more that age heap tends to be more pronounced exactly in those populations. It's a probability. They have higher chances of having this issue. But it's not just related to education. There are other things that might be causing that. And that's the next slide here. And that's also discussed in the textbook. I mean, what I'm trying to say is like there are several reasons of why people might misreport their ages. The low levels of education is one. And if you think about countries with lower levels of education, exactly developing countries. But in some cultures, certain numbers and digits are avoided. So 13 is frequently avoided in the West because it's considered unlucky. For example, hotels in the West and some Western countries sometimes do not have floors designated as 13. So maybe someone is 13 years old and his or her parent might report in a survey that that child is actually 12 or 14 years old. And this is an interesting thing. I didn't know that this 13 was so considered unlucky in the US. So when I went to some elevators in the US and I saw some floors being called 12 and then 12A or something like that, and then going to 14, that was an interesting thing to see. But it's exactly related to culture. And the numeral 4 is avoided in Korea and China since it has the same sound as the word for death. So many hotels in China, South Korea, and some other East Asian countries do not have floors designated as 4. And because of that, you might have some misreporting of ages that contain the number 4, right? So it could be related to education, as I mentioned before here, but it could also be related to cultural aspects of specific societies, right? So these are some examples. How do we know if we have problems with the data, these inconsistencies of data related to the age of the individuals? This Whipple's method tries to measure if there's too much inconsistency on the data, if the information is not so stable across the different ages. So the Whipple's method measures preferences for the terminal digits of 0 and 5, usually in the age range of 23 to 62. So we get population for single ages. That's what I said in the slide before here. Demographers use data from single years of age to determine whether there are irregularities or inconsistencies in the data. So we get the number of people for each one of the single ages in a specific population in a specific year, 23, 24, 25, and until 62. And then we put all these people between 23 and 62 years of age in the denominator. And then in the numerator, we just put those people with terminal digits equal to 0 and 5. So 25, 35, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, and 60, right? And then we just get these ones here, add them all, get all these people between 23 to 62, add them all, and divide one by the other. And here, and then we just multiply it by 5 and then 100. That's how it's a usual way to do this method, to implement this method. Here, for every 5 ages, we have 1 age in the numerator. For every 5 specific ages we have in the denominator, we're gonna have 1 here. So that's why we multiply by 5, because if this ratio here tends to be equals to 1, then we're okay. We don't have any issues. We have no preference for 0 or 5. And then we multiply by 100 to kind of interpret this in a more percentage way. So technically, the Whipple's method could have the following values. 0, the digits of 0 and 5 are not reported. Let's see that nobody in a specific population reported being 25, 30, 35, 55, and 60 years old. So you would have 0 people here. 0 divided by this would be 0. Multiply by 5, 0, and then 0. So technically we could have 0, but that actually in reality don't happen. Technically we could have also 100. What is 100? When there is no preference for 0 and 5. The data is kind of consistent. Around the ages, you have like similar levels of people reporting 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, and then 60, 61, 62. When it's more consistent, there is no preference, it's more constant within the specific subgroups. In this case here I said like 23, 24, 25, 26, for example. Then there is no preference for 0 and 5. So these numbers here, we add them all, divided by these ones, multiply by 5, we tend to be equal to 1. Multiply by 100 is 100. As I said before, in the numerator, we have 5 times less groups than in the denominator. And then we multiply by 5 and the ratio equals 1, and then equals 100, no preference for 0 and 5. But let's say in a specific population, everybody reports being Only 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, and 60. Nobody reports being 23, 24, 26, 27, and so on. The number in the numerator is going to be the same as the number in the denominator. So this is going to be equal to 1. 1 times 5 times 100, 500, right? But these numbers here, exactly 0 and exactly 500, don't really happen that way in real life, because there are no cases, empirical data, in which you have nobody reporting ages, or you have, in the other way, everybody reporting only these ages. So based on real data about age distribution, this Whipple's method kind of mentioned the accuracy of the data related to the age of the population. If the Whipple's method is below 105, it means highly accurate. Between 105 and 109.9, fairly accurate. 10 to 125, approximate. 25 to 75, rough. And higher than 175, very rough. See that we are not reaching 500. If we reach 175, we are already saying, this is bad. This is bad data related to the age of the population, because a lot of people are reporting more ages ending in 0 and 5, okay? So here, for Korea, for example, these are single ages from age 0 until age 85. Here in 85, it has this peak here because we are getting all people with at least 85 years of age. So this is 85 plus, getting everybody here. Just to summarize the data, it's not an issue with the data itself, right? And you see some variations. Declining, increase, and decline. And as people get older, they start to die and start to decline. So you see some variations, of course. But for ages that are close to each other, they don't vary so much. There is variation, but they're a little closer to each other, right? But as people get older, chances of dying increases, and then it starts to go down. The number of people in specific older ages. But using the Whipple's method to calculate the accuracy of this age data, we reach with 100.1, which in this case shows that this data is highly accurate for Korea, for South Korea. For Pakistan, on the other hand, you see all these jumps. Say on the age of 20, 25, 30, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, and so on. You see all these jumps. The difference between neighboring ages can be really high. It's not so consistent as we saw for the case of Korea. So here's an indication that there is some preference for ages ending in 0 or 5. And when we implement the Whipple's method to see whether this variation here is showing problems with the age data, we see that's a very rough data. It goes to 330 in a scale that we saw. 175 was already very rough. 330 is really bad. So in this case, if we are analyzing data from Pakistan, we would not analyze information for single ages. It would be better to group people in at least 5-year age groups, from 40 to 44, 45 to 49, 50 to 54. You could implement some methods that would try to smooth a little bit these curves, but the easiest way to deal with it is just to use age groups instead of single ages. But it's important to analyze it to see that this data has issues with it. The next type topic in the chapter is related to sex structure. And we already talked about it again in the on chapter 1, related to sex ratio, in which sex ratio was one of the examples that I gave as what exactly is a ratio. Sex ratio is the most popular index of sex composition in demographic analysis. It is identified as the number of males per 100 females. So how do you do that? You just get the population of males in a specific society in a specific year, divided by the population of females, multiplied by 100. If sex ratio is above 100, indicates more males than females. Below 100, more females than males, okay? In general, the national sex ratios, taking into account people of all ages, tend to fall in the narrow range from about 95 to 102. National sex ratios outside of the range of 90 to 105 should be viewed as extreme. So that country might have more preference for boys than women. Or there is a lot of like discrepancy also in terms of mortality rates by sex, right? So it's important to see the trends in sex ratio to exactly see if it's falling under this, what you would say, a more normal range from 95 to 102, or if it go above 105 or below 90, right? And here we are comparing two different groups. Males, number of men divided by the number of women. The size of two groups. So that's why it's a ratio. The denominator is not at risk. It's not at a chance of it going into the numerator. So it's not a rate. When we talk about, for example, death rate, we have the population in a specific country in the denominator and number of people who died for a specific disease in that specific country. So the population of that country is at risk of moving from the denominator to the numerator and experiencing that death. In that case, it would be a rate. Here's a ratio because we're comparing two different groups. The same thing about the total dependency ratio. We're comparing the size of children and older people to the working age population. Those are different groups. One is not at risk of going to the numerator in that specific year, okay? Based on data collected in that specific year in that specific country. Because they're either classified as children or elderly people or as working people. In this case, they're either classified as males or as females. And here, this is a similar graph that I showed to you in the previous lecture from 1950 to 2015. And it's just interesting to see the trends over time from 1950 to 2015. More developed regions, as we talked before, usually there is no preference for female births. And since women live longer, usually you have more women than men. So for every, let's say here in 2015, for every 100 men, you tend to have 95, for every 100 women, we tend to have 95 men. So fewer men than women in more developed regions. In less developed regions, where there's more preference for female birth, and still there is women who might still have on average higher chances of surviving at older ages, that doesn't compensate. So overall, in less developed regions, for every 100 women, you have more than 103 men. So more men than women. For the United States, also developed country, you see the ratios all below 100%. It means more women than men. In China, more men than women, because all these years is above 100. And in the US, as I mentioned, maybe like in these previous decades, maybe the mortality was improving faster among women, they were living longer, so we were having even fewer men compared to women. But as mortality starts to decline also among men, then you start to see an increase in the sex ratios, right? It starts to get closer to 100. These are the sex ratios, and this is for a specific year for Korea, but now the horizontal axis is the age group. And what you see is that probably a really strong preference for male birth. So the sex ratio at birth, or the sex ratio among children between the ages of 0 and 4 is above 110. 110 boys between the ages of 0 and 4 for every 100 women, 100 girls. This is not exactly sex at birth, because we are grouping these people here between 0 and 4. Sex ratio at birth is only people that were born in that specific year. So it would be people up to the age of 1. And then as people get older, more and mortality is higher among men than women. And then the sex ratio starts to decline by age, meaning that now in older ages here, starting 50 to 54, you start to see more women than men, or less men than women in our population. So in the previous graph, we have countries over time. And here we have one country for different age groups. So it's interesting to see that we can use the same indicator and organize our data in different ways to conduct our analysis. The sex ratios by age group in the United Arab Emirates, really high among adults, those between 35 and 74 years of age. So much higher than 100. Higher than 100, what does it mean? More men, more male dominant. When Patrick, right? Yeah. Patrick said here. So for example here, 50 to 54, around, let's say 320 men for every 100 women. And the trend here, it's really explained by how the society is organized. United Arab Emirates attracts a lot of immigrants to work on oil production, right? And those people, they are usually more men doing this work, so those are the ones moving to this country, and they are usually in more older ages, not so younger ages. Start to increase exactly at the age of 30, right? And then as these people retire, they might go back to their home country, and then the sex ratio declines. But also because you have more mortality of this group compared to women who live in this country. Right, so in this case here in the United Arab Emirates, this really high sex ratios, so more number of men than women, is really related to immigration of workers into this country. This is data from 2000. And this is the same country, United Arab Emirates, but now in more recent year, 2015. This is kind of like gives us pretty much the same idea as the previous graph. But here we have by age, we get the numerator, the number of men in each one of these age groups, and divided by the number of women in each one of these age groups. Let's say, okay, let's not divide one by the other. Let's put men in one side and women in the other side by age. What do we get? The age sex structure that we saw before. All right, the sex ratio divides one by the other. If you just put men on one side and women on the other side by age, that's age sex structure of that country in that specific year. Then you see that the overall amount of the population in thousands here, so for example, from 30 to 34, you had in this specific, in 2015, around 660,000 men. And for women, it was around 240,000 women, right? So much higher numbers of men in labor ages than women. But as these men start to die, or they might going back to their home countries after they retire, then the overall number of men starts to be smaller in comparison. There are still more men in these older ages than women, but the difference here is not so big as it was in labor ages. Okay? So just to show that if you have more data, you can disaggregate it, don't necessarily divide one by the other, you get more information. Cool? I also mentioned the sex ratio at birth. And in most societies, they have sex ratios at birth of around 105. So usually for every 100 girls that are born in a specific country in a specific year, on average, usually the biological normal is 105 boys for every 100 girls. And the reason for that is really not well explained still. There are some theories that try to explain that. There is one theory called the fragile male hypothesis, that boys, they're more fragile at birth and they have a higher chance of dying. So in a lot of societies, when families don't have enough resources, they even sometimes give more resources to the boy because the boy is trying to compensate the biological limitations, and then they kind of neglect the baby girls, and that influences mortality of baby girls. But even in societies that don't have that kind of preference, still you have more boys being born than girls. And so this fragile male hypothesis comes with the idea that nature in some way adapted itself that there's a higher chance of boys being born since they will have higher chance of dying that will compensate over time, right? So over time, since women, they die with lower chances, lower mortality rates, not only in younger ages, but even in older ages, it kind of stabilizes over time. So a lot of different theories behind it, and it's still an interesting topic to go deep into it. And in this case, kind of makes the intersection between demography, public health, biology, all these different sciences trying to understand these issues or these trends. But several countries like China, Taiwan, South Korea, India, and several other Asian countries have been reporting abnormally high sex ratios at birth since the 1980s. The main reason that we see many more boys being born than girls is because a lot of these countries now, when a woman gets pregnant, she can also do an ultrasound and know the sex of the baby. And since in those cultures there is a more preference for baby boys, if they're pregnant with a girl, they might perform an abortion. So it's a main intervention is prenatal sex identification followed by gender-specific abortion. It's pretty much they prefer more boys. If they are pregnant with a girl, do the ultrasound, and then they perform the abortion. Then the number of boys being born in comparison to girls increases a lot. In China and Taiwan have a Confucian patriarchal tradition where some preference is strong and pervasive. Birth planning policies, socioeconomic changes, and industrial transformations have been responsible for a rapid decline in fertility. And this is really clear in China. In China, with the implementation of the one-child policy, they tried to make families have up to one child, and if they had more than one child, those families would not have access to education system, to the health system for their children. And also because China started to experience socioeconomic changes, socioeconomic development, started to be more expensive to have a lot of children. It's more expensive to give them good education and so on, get good jobs and so on. people start to have fewer children. And then because exactly of cultural preferences, they start to say, oh, since we're going to have fewer children, and we might have just one, and the first pregnancy girl, the abortion is performed. So ultrasound technology enables the prenatal determination of sex, followed by an abortion if they want a boy. And so in China, the one-child policy, even with the one-child policy, usually the total fertility rate kind of like was still around 2 children. That means that on average, women were having 2 children throughout their reproductive ages, between 15 and 49 years of age. But still with the implementation of that, the family planning program or the birth planning policy, still people were having 2 children. But even that, it was not 1, it was 2. They were still having preference for boys, right? It's kind of like the culture influencing demography, influencing age structure. Age, in this case, sex structure of the population. So these are examples of Taiwan in blue, China in red, and the US in light green yellow. I don't know which color is that here. So in the US, it's a society that doesn't have preference for baby girls or baby boys. It follows more the biological normal of 105 boys being born for every 100 girls through these years here, shown in this graph, 1980 to 2010. Taiwan is higher, and actually went a little higher in the 90s, but it's kind of like around 110 boys being born for every 100 girls. But in China, after the implementation of the one-child policy, you start to have a lot of preference for boys, right? And the policy ended after that, so it reached the really high numbers of 110, 120. 120 boys being born in this specific year here of 2010 for every 100 girls. So that's really high, considering that this one here is the biological normal, right? And another topic that's important to discuss, and it's related to age and sex composition, and in this case, more related to age, is population aging, which is related to that topic that I said before when we were talking about the population pyramids or the age-sex structure. Large numbers of elderly persons is not a problem if there are large numbers of producers. So we are talking with the same language that we are talking about the total dependency ratio, or this specific case, the old age dependency ratio. It is a problem when the ratio of the elderly to producers become high, generate socioeconomic problems. Just remember that graph about Brazil, in which I mentioned the demographic dividend, the window of opportunity. If at that specific moment, when the total dependency ratio was in its lowest level, so fewer consumers than producers, the government, the society did not take that moment into account, did not advantage of that moment, did not give good jobs for the people in working ages so they could save for the future. When these people that did not save or get good jobs, good training, they cannot save for the future after retirement. When they get older, then they will start to experience some social problems. So these people start to go into poverty, not being able to afford housing, buying food, and so on. And they will put pressure on the social security system of that specific country. So it's good for us to know the amount of people we know their ages, like in terms of population age, and in terms of like how many people we will have that we have to support them in terms of social security benefits, health services, housing, and so on. Okay? So in 2020, projections indicate that more than 1 billion older persons are living now in the US, right? So these were projections from previous years, projecting for the year that we are living right now. So you might have more than 1 billion people in the world right now with at least 60 years of age. And in China, there will be 23.4% of all these people with at least 60 years of age now in 2020, they live in China. And 7.4% of these 1 billion people live in the US. So China is the country that has most of these older people living in their country right now, right? China has such a big population and they had improvements in mortality, more people living to reach at least 60 years of age. They have almost, for pretty much like a quarter of all people with at least 60 years of age, they are residents of China. In 2020, like also based on projects for previous years to the year that we are living right now, indicate almost 149 or 150 million people with at least 80 years of age, the oldest old people. Out of these 150 million people with at least 80 years of age, almost 20% are in China and almost 9% are in the US. So one of every 4 people with at least 60 years of age live in China. And one of every 5 people with 80 years of age, at least 80 years of age, live in China. So it shows us how the Chinese population is getting older. It's really experiencing population aging, and overall, it comprises most of this old population of the world. And these are just the numbers to give the absolute numbers of it. So here we have 2010, the total population, 2050, the expected population around 9.4 million people in the world, the people with at least 60 years of age, and the people with at least 80 years of age. And this data that I showed here, 2020, 60 plus and 80 plus. So I pretty much just got here China, this number, divided by the 1 billion, so 250 divided by 1 billion, is exactly that number, close to 25%. And this number here, 28 million divided by the 148 million is 19.4%. Okay, so this percentage here, they come here. And more than 1 billion people is exactly this number. And almost 149 million people is exactly this number. This is just to show that you can summarize a table like this in a few sentences by just comparing the group that we show in these different cells. Cool? I mentioned before, if governments don't take into account the size of older people, or they don't take advantage of total dependency ratios being low in the window of opportunity whenever specific countries experience this trend, then as these people get older, they don't have enough savings, they will put more pressure on government spending on pensions. So this is data that was compiled by The Economist, and Jairo Nicolau, he is a Brazilian political scientist, and he just reorganized a little bit the graph. I prefer his graph than the one by The Economist because it's just easier to read the name of the countries here. And the horizontal axis, we have the population age 65 years and over as a percentage of the total population. So here we are saying with data from 2017, that Japan had around, let's say, 27% of people had at least 65 years of age. Brazil, in 2017, had around 5% of the people with at least 65 years of age. Considering now another source of data, how much the government is spending on pension benefits as a percentage of the gross domestic product. What is the gross domestic product? Consider all the production that is, all the wealth, all the production that's produced in a specific country in a specific year. Out of all that's produced in the country in this specific year, how much is spent by the government on pension benefits? In Brazil, 12%. In Japan, 12%. Why is this important? We see that usually, as we have more people, more percentage of the people, a higher proportion of people older ages, what it happens? The government starts to spend a higher proportion of its own GDP on pension benefits. As we have more older people, yeah, it's obvious, we start to see more government spending related to pension benefits. But then there are some outliers. Japan has a high proportion of people in older ages, but it's kind of like spending almost the same levels as in Finland and in Slovenia, for example. Less than in Italy, Greece, and Portugal, which have proportionally fewer older people. What's the country with the big problem here? Brazil. Because it has only 5%, around 5% of its population with at least 65 years of age, and it's already spending 12% of its own GDP on pension benefits. So from all that's produced in the country by the economy of the country, 12% it's already being spent by the government to provide retirement benefits to the population of older people, although the population of older people is only 5% of the population. How exactly you do a reform on how to spend on pensions benefits, that's open to debate. So right now in Brazil, there is a lot of debate in other countries as well. Oh yeah, we should do some reform of our pension system. But then people more in the right wing, they actually usually support breaking down, giving lower benefits for those people that already have lower earnings. And people on the left like, no, let's increase taxes and break down the benefits of people who receive a lot of earnings to decline inequality. So the way that you do it, the way that you deal with this issue is open for debate. So this is data, objective data being collected. How the government will implement policies to deal with this issue. Usually people try to say, oh, we are doing objective scientific analysis. Everything is open to debate, right? Which population will be benefited if we decline the pension benefits for exactly those people that already have lower earnings, the majority of the population, right? So that's a really controversial topic, and we see a lot of debate going on in several different countries, right? And a lot of economists, demographers, and people in the government do a series of studies trying to deal with these trends, to these issues, this pressure on government spending. All cool? Any questions? So we still have 6 minutes here. And just to remind you, I showed you this Excel spreadsheet, how to calculate age sex structure in Excel. And I mentioned that if you have a population broken by age group for a specific year, by sex, in this case male and female, if you just put this information here, this spreadsheet automatically calculates the estimate or creates this graph, because this cell here is getting information from above. It's getting the number of women in this group divided by the overall number of women and men in the country in that year. And for male, click here twice, the same idea. The number of men in that specific age group divided by the overall number of men and women in Brazil in that year. Cool? So this is the way to do it. But then I showed you that populationpyramid.net, that you can already select a country and it creates the population pyramids for you for several years. So in this topic here, in the next chapter, just be sure which is the chapter 11, right? That's chapter 12. Chapter 12 is world population trends over time. That's the next topic here. Some of the graphs and information that I added here, I suggest to you watching this video here in our course website. This one by Hans Rosling. It's like 1 hour long, extra time, but really interesting the way that he presents some of the population projections and the population trends over time. And he was a public health researcher, professor. He died a few years ago. He created, I mentioned to you already, this Gapminder Institute that creates a series of different videos and data that's provided in a really friendly way. So some of these slides you see in the source, Hans Rosling, and this title here of the video. And I pretty much watched it and then created some tables based on what he's talking in this lecture here. So in this chapter, I'm going to focus on two main topics. I talked to you about 5 contemporary aspects of the importance of demography, 5 major changes that we are seeing in the world related to demographic indicators. And I'm going to talk also about demographic transition. Demographic transition is pretty much gives us an idea of the overall changes that are going on in terms of mortality and fertility throughout the human history. And is related to the chapter about theories of demography, right? So demographic transition will be also be discussed there. And if you look again in the course website, some of the videos here down the chapter about theories of demography, we have these videos about demographic transition. Oh, this one is just a song, but these other 2 talk exactly about that, all right? And these slides here, I will not cover them in our class. So these are just extra readings that I got from another textbook. It's just another way to present these different changes that are going on in the world through time. So I will just start a little bit talking about these 5 contemporary aspects of demography. The 5 topics here in this first bullet point are related to greatest demographic change in human history. The population increased a lot in these last centuries in our history. So we had a lot of improvement in mortality, people living longer, and that made the population increase a lot. And more recently, with declines in fertility, then you start to see a more stabilization of the population, but there is a lot of variation across countries. And related to that, you have spectacular gains in life expectancy. Mortality is declined, so people live longer. More recent decades, related to what I just said here now, you have fertility declines And in some cases, some countries have some women having less than 2 children throughout their reproductive lives. Whenever you have a country with a total fertility rate below 2.1, in other words, women having on average less than 2.1 children, that country is experiencing below replacement fertility. Unbalanced sex ratios at birth, like we just saw in the previous chapter, some countries reaching sex ratio at birth around 120, like in China. And population aging, higher proportion of people with at least 65 and 80 years of age. Okay, so I will continue on this topic in the next class on Tuesday. It's already 4:30. The quiz number 3, it's open on Canvas, and it's going to be open until tomorrow at noon. And it's about the chapter related to age and sex composition. Okay? So quiz 3 is out there. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and I see you guys on Tuesday.